Hello and welcome to the Employee Advocacy and Influence podcast. My name is Lewis Gray. I'm a senior marketing manager here at Disseminate. My co-host for this episode is Elliot Elsley, and our special guest for today is Stefanie Del Moral, who is a global digital marketing manager at Signify. So this is a really interesting episode for us because typically on this podcast, we'll speak with the people who are managing, overseeing and curating content for employee advocacy programs. Stefanie differs in this regard in that she is an end user. So while she works within the marketing team, she's actually somebody who is just focused on building her personal brand online. And she does that by firstly creating her own content, but then also leveraging the content from Signify's employee advocacy program. We were really keen to speak to Stefanie just because she's built such a strong personal brand online, but also just because we thought it would be great to get that end user perspective. So it's a really refreshing conversation. It's full of tips that you can use if you're somebody participating in a program yourself, if you're trying to build your own personal brand, or if you are somebody who is managing an employee advocacy program. And this is exactly the type of thing that you'll want to share share with your employee advocates, because it's full of actionable advice. Stefanie was kind enough to share some of the barriers, the psychological barriers that she encountered when she was attempting to build her own personal brand on LinkedIn and when she first tried to start posting. She shared some tips on how to build a posting routine and how she goes about curating her own content every week. There's a really nice bit in there about how she takes herself on coffee dates as well to kind of sit down and brainstorm ideas, and she uses habit stacking to build it into her day to day. So it's a really great list, and I hope you guys will stick around to the end as well, because she was kind enough to share some of the biggest wins that she's seen personally from doing all of this. But before we jump into the episode, we're currently collecting submissions for the 2026 edition of the Employee Advocacy Benchmark Report. We'll link to it in the show notes. It takes about 6 to 7 minutes to complete, but it's for both employee advocacy program managers and employee advocates alike. Last year's edition was received so well, but we can only put something like this together with your support and with your insights. If you do take the time to fill in the report, you'll have the chance to be quoted in it. We can feature your name, the quote itself, and you'll also be entered into a draw to win one of 5 $100 Amazon vouchers. So as I said, the link will be in the show notes. We really appreciate your contributions. But without further ado, let's get into the episode. So Stefanie, just right off the bat, would you mind just telling our listeners a little bit about yourself? So, your role, your background and things like that.
Sure. So thank you, Lewis and Elliot, for having me here. I'm Stefanie Del Moral. Currently, I work for Signify. Well, I say currently, but I've been there for 4 years already. And I'm a global digital marketing manager. I'm part of the global team, even though I'm based in Madrid. And I have over 12 years of experience on digital marketing across different industries such as automotive, fast mover consumer goods, and electrical and electronics manufacturer. What else? I've been part of different advocacy sharing programs, and I'm more than eager to share what's been my journey using this while building my personal brand.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's what stood out to me in our initial conversations, to be honest with you, is it. So for the listeners' sake, Stefanie here is an end user, as you said, in an employee advocacy program. And it's not really a perspective that we've had on the podcast before. We often speak with program managers, but we had a great conversation about personal branding and things like that. So I'm excited to dive into all of that, during this recording for all of our listeners to hear. But before we dive into the how, can you just give us a quick overview of the employee advocacy programs that you've been a part of?
Sure. So I'm part of the social sharing program at Signify. I want to say kudos for my colleagues, Alexandra and Martina, if you ever get to listen to this, because they have made this program quite user-friendly and intuitive. We have guidelines. There is also a community in which we can be part of. We have even done gamification in order to see which region, not person, gets to share the most, and then we have rewards, etc. So in that sense, that's part of the program I am now. But in the past, because I mentioned I've been part of different companies, I have been working with LinkedIn. I was just remembering that 10 years ago, I was part of this, let's say, cross-functional team in SEAT to build the CEO professional LinkedIn profile. So that was, let's say, revolutionary back then. And yeah, I remember that's where I learned how to engage with the platform, how to get to work with it. And of course, along with internal communication, we were able to create these guidelines to make this kickoff. But also, I have a pretty bad practice to share. That was a long time ago as well. But I was part of a company in which the advocacy program was mandatory for all employees. And one of my responsibilities there was actually chase employees for them to publish on behalf of the company and report back to management if they didn't do this. That wasn't part of any contract. So it was just as soon as you entered the company, let's say that was part of the ground rules. And as I mentioned, it was mandatory. We needed to have the company visual identity, use it as well, even though, of course, LinkedIn is a personal social platform. So yeah, I was really amazed when I started to remember.
I'm glad you say it's bad practice, because it categorically is. It's never anything we would ever recommend people say, make this mandatory. With that said, and I won't name names client-wise and things like that from our side, I have seen clients, generally speaking, advocacy is really optional, right? You should be able to opt into this. It's not an opt-out thing. It's, hey, this is something I'd like to do. I have seen some benefits with clients that are a little bit more sales focused, let's go with, that say, there's incentive tied against this. And, I've seen it's almost like a qualification point from that perspective. It's like if you're not posting on LinkedIn, then you don't qualify for extra commission or whatever it might be. I think it makes sense in some of those kind of more smaller, nuanced elements of things for certain teams where you can kind of incentivize behavior with it. But for big businesses, it's, largely definitely not the way to kind of go about that at all. It's quite a scary thought, to be honest. Was there a lot of backlash around it? Were people kind of perturbed by it?
No, not really. And as I mentioned, it was really a long time ago. And I believe the company disappeared because, when you get to see this, yes, you have this feeling of how the company culture was. Unfortunately, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's always something. It's actually always something that we look at, even when we are going through a sales process on our side of things. Like a qualification criteria is we look at people's Glassdoor reviews. If people's Glassdoor reviews are 1 star, 2 star, it's never a great sign for somebody's company culture. Some people have got unlucky in that world, but it's usually a pretty bad sign that advocacy probably isn't for them straight off the bat.
It's something that we've definitely discussed on the podcast plenty in the past is it's kind of like the number one way to kill an employee advocacy program is just mandating social sharing. Our CEO actually put a post on LinkedIn about it last week, and I thought he really hit the nail on the head. But if you want to, we'll come on to this, but if you want to encourage your employees to build their personal brands in the way that we're going to discuss in the most effective way, mandating it is the fastest way to make sure that doesn't happen, quite frankly. But Stephanie, something that you said to me in our call a while back was that personal branding has opened doors for you professionally. So building your brand on LinkedIn. But just for our listeners' sake, what does brand building mean to you on a personal level?
Sure. So I think at the beginning, it was me discovering that I could also add value as an individual contributor beyond, let's say, me as an employee for a X company, right? So that was the first, knowing, hey, there's something I can also tell. I know by heart, this metric, which is like 90% of LinkedIn users, they don't post, they only post whenever they get a new job. But what happens between those? Let's imagine I didn't post for 4 years. What happened there? So in that sense, that was my realization. Nowadays, the objective I have, it's for me to take my professional career, my path, whatever, to the next level. And with that, I'm not even talking about getting a new job. It's just how I want to portray myself as a professional and how I can contribute to the network, okay? And how have I how what's the reward I've seen from engaging more than others in the platform. I'll say is these opportunities of doing public speaking is one of my passions, and I've been able to do that through in conferences, at podcasts, and even giving lectures at school for students, etc. So in that sense, I just say it's work in progress for me, but definitely have a clear path that the platform I want to use, it's LinkedIn, because that's where my audience is, let's say.
Do you find that's been a kind of slow growth process where like bit by bit you've grown, your network's built, more and more people are engaging kind of more regularly? Or was there kind of a single point where you went, this post went really, really viral? I tend to find people have two different paths with this. Some people just get almost, for use of a better term, lucky that they just go viral. They hit a kind of really good post and it ticks them into the kind of next stage. Others, based on what you've described there, like grow just very naturally, and it's just like, I understand what I'm doing. There's a kind of rinse and repeat process for this.
Exactly. In my case, it has been this slow but steady process. What I notice is that consistency has worked for me. Even though LinkedIn, as any other social platforms, has an algorithm, and then they also change the algorithm, and then we need to learn how to play the game, let's say. But yes, in my case, it's as a marketeer, thankfully, I have that background. I can also apply my marketing knowledge into my personal brand, and also, let's say, analyze whatever I'm doing to see if it's working or no, and how I can iterate and trial and error, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's such a better way of going about it. I think the single posts where one person kind of posts something and they get 500 likes, 1,000 likes on LinkedIn, it can be so disappointing for them on the second post when it doesn't do anywhere near those kind of numbers, and then all of a sudden people get kind of massively disheartened and have to like start from the bottom really, really quickly.
I can add to that. Let's say the example of if you go viral, right? If you go viral, the good thing is that you have an insight of might it work in your audience, right? It might be the format, or it might be the content itself, but then when you translate it into your day-to-day, you need to track if this is the formula, if it's working, and still be consistent. Because otherwise you won't get to see results in the long term.
I'm glad you've touched on consistency, because it's come up in a number of our episodes recently when we've asked people about, we've been speaking with program managers, so the people who are overseeing these programs, and they've been saying that the hardest thing is getting people to start posting, because they have that fear of when they post for the first time, nobody will care. And it's what you said, you have to keep posting, and then you start to achieve that snowball effect. But from somebody who's done it, and let's say hypothetically you're speaking to somebody in a corporate role who's never posted, what would you say to them to help them get started?
Okay, sure. So first, let's say you only get to LinkedIn every 2 years whenever you change your role. So I will say, please update your LinkedIn profile and make it align with whatever you want to communicate, okay? Then secondly, what I did, it's to detect what was my value proposition, okay? So what is something that I could contribute, again, as a personal brand. And then I sat down with myself for, let's say, a day, and then I did something called it the content pillars, which is to identify uh, in which areas I want to create content out of my value proposition. I can give you examples. I have a pillar on e-commerce and marketing, another on leadership, professional growth, and female energy at the workplace, etc. Right? And after that, after I have that clear, I did this raw list of posts I could create. So let's say evergreen content. And that's pretty useful whenever you run out of ideas. On top of that, there is what is happening in your life, in the industry, in markets, so you can also add to the conversation, right? But that's like more of ongoing. And then it's like locking yourself, let's say, and have a coffee date to create content on a more regularly basis, let's say.
How do you balance the like personal side? You mentioned sort of like the more kind of like what's going on in your life. Do you strike a balance between content that's, more personal versus more professional? Do you just kind of let things land how they may if there's something going on that's kind of relevant? Is that like a secret sauce that you kind of try and layer into stuff?
I'll say it's the second option, what you just mentioned. A bit of both, because since I'm working, let's say, on this professional and personal type of content, because we're not a separate person outside of work, right? Our values chase us at work, in our personal life, etc. So, and we spend more than 8 hours at work, right? So what does it mean? That whatever the person I am outside, I'm also inside, and my personal, let's say, learnings, I can also put those into practice. And I mean, at the end of the day, I do marketing, so many things that we get to do in our daily basis, like even watching this advertising on YouTube, you can get learnings from that in sharing. So in that sense, I've done that, but it's totally fine, like to focus on professional. For me, it might work the mix of both.
Stephanie, I'm gonna, I guess, reword my question now because I'm curious now to
Okay.
hear, I guess, what were the biggest blockers for you when you got started? So I mentioned the program manager often telling us what their employees are saying. You obviously being an end user, you've mentioned things like, self-doubt, fear of judgment we touched upon and not knowing what to post. But which of these things felt most real to you when you were first starting out?
Yes, I could definitely relate with the fear of judgment. Yeah, especially the fear of judgment for ex colleagues or current colleagues. Like, what are they going to think about what I'm posting? And then I realized, like, once I started to do that, and I'm gonna quote myself, let data talk and not personal opinions. So if my content was performing well, that was, let's say, the green light for me to continue. But surprisingly, also I got feedback from my own colleagues saying that they like my content, and they even, let's say, encourage me to continue. Okay. So yes, I will, in my case, I will say let data talk.
I think that's always such an interesting part of it when people come into this and there's just like this natural, like, what if people think I'm silly for posting this? What if people, and it's just it's an it's like a really normal human interaction. The thing I've always spoken about with people from that perspective is like, can you remember the last post that you saw on LinkedIn that you like that didn't resonate with you? Essentially, like, you just forget these things almost
Yes.
immediately, whereas the ones you remember is like, oh, actually that was really interesting, I'm going to save that, I'm going to come back to that later, I'm going to send it to somebody else.
I think as well, it's just that I saw a fantastic, I don't want to call it a meme, but a graphic on LinkedIn recently. And it's basically everything that you want to achieve on LinkedIn is kind of on the other side of embarrassed or worrying about embarrassing yourself. It's just like you have to kind of put yourself out there and do it. And like Elliot said, and as you've seen with your colleagues, people are generally pretty supportive. When I see any of our colleagues at Disseminate going and creating posts of their own, they're sharing selfies and stuff like that. I'm sharing it with other people and being like, oh, we should go give this post a like. This is great. Like, let's encourage more of this because it's just great to see. And everybody will say the exact same thing. We're all kind of in the same boat, but we all worry about the same things. But
Yeah.
I want to stay on the psychology of sharing here, we'll call it. But something that you mentioned a moment ago, I think it was in your answer to your answer, sorry, to my last question, tripping over my words here. But you're clearly quite intentional with what you post. You mentioned the content pillars and stuff like that. And you kind of touched on this, going to a coffee shop and planning your posts. It's something that you discussed with me in our initial conversation. But can you just explain to our listeners how you plan your posts and come up with ideas and what that routine looks like for you?
Sure. So I take myself once or twice a week for a coffee date. Usually, because I know where my brain functions better, and that's very early in the morning. I will go to a coffee place, 8 a.m. Before I start working. I will order my favorite coffee, and I would just jump in there, and I will sit for an hour until I get 2 to 3 posts a week. I could also do it during lunch break. But I dedicate around 1 to 2 hours to create content. But I'm always on LinkedIn engaging with others because that's another very smart way to grow as well. Because you can also add value in that sense. And I must say that for me has worked because I have applied something called habit stacking. So for me, I was going to do the coffee anyway. I just add one habit to another one. So for me, it's easier to do that.
Have you by any chance read James Clear's Atomic Habits?
I have.
Amazing. Yeah, perfect. It's a bit of a running joke between me and a couple of my colleagues in marketing because I mention it so often on this podcast that you think we have some sort of paid partnership. I can assure listeners that's not the case, but it's a fantastic book because I think if you're trying to build a posting habit, just making it part of your daily routine is exactly, how to make it stick. Stefanie, you're obviously an end user of an employee advocacy program. And as I said at the beginning, it's something that I wanted to get your perspective on. And something that's been coming up a lot recently with a number of our other guests is balancing employees' voices while still staying on brand. And this is especially the case when we're speaking with people who are working in regulated industries, as an example. But you touched on it at the beginning of the episode. You mentioned about the fact you have great guidelines, but do you think it's possible to still be creative and authentic? So authentically you, Stefanie, while staying within the brand guidelines at Signify?
Oh, yes, for sure. It's not only that I get to use the guidelines, I have approached my manager several times, not only like for creating content on LinkedIn, but also talking on behalf of the company, the do's and don'ts, right? So once you have that alignment and you give that visibility to your manager, I will also get to use what's, let's say, the best practice on LinkedIn. Keep that in mind. So for me, it's 3 guidelines that I have internalized already in the back of my mind running. And then once I have that, I let myself flow. In the sense that I do have my own tone of voice. You do have my do's and don'ts. Let's say I'm not a fan of emoticons, not even in my real life. My friends say, please use more emoticons on WhatsApp because otherwise you sound angry all the time. But anyway, like I even apply that, and whatever I get to use AI, of course, I will in my prompts I will say, please keep that tone of voice as well, etc. So in that say, I feel like free enough to, let's say, express myself.
I think it's really interesting that you say that as well. The guidelines and the kind of the guardrails almost that you have with a lot of these. Do you ever find, and this may be not particularly relevant, in regards to the kind of business that you're working in, but do you find you push those guardrails at any points? Do you have kind of if you're unsure, do you go and double check with somebody about kind of wording or how you might phrase something? Or do you kind of just let it fly and wait and see if you get kind of asked about it?
No. I definitely have. Thankfully, being part of the marketing team, let's say I have a really close relationship with copywriters, for example, and I have even asked for their advice on how to communicate a certain thing. So in that sense, I rather to do a check-in whatever I'm doing, any corporate communication, let's say, so I'm safe, right? And whatever I get to do on the personal side, my personal values match with the company values. So that's why I'm working for this company, because I feel they relate. So I don't think it will clash, let's say.
No, I mean, that's a healthy place to be. I think it's more challenging when you start getting into, some of the pharmaceutical brands, some of the
Oh, yeah.
financial services businesses that we work with. That's where those guardrails start to become a little bit more, you need to say things in a very particular manner. I think that makes it more challenging for employees in regards to being creative and developing a personal brand. And in my experience, and it's great that you have the creative freedom essentially to be able to go and post whatever you want. In my experience, the more that's hampered, the less people are inclined to do anything whatsoever. And then it's really, really hard to kind of encourage people to be a thought leader. And particularly in those spaces where, pharmaceuticals as an example, you want somebody to be a kind of thought leader and pioneer for things. But if you box them in, they can't, because they just don't. They're too scared about what they're going to post. So it's really, really nice to hear that you've got that kind of, those guardrails exist, but you feel really aligned to it all.
Yeah, also because I'm a fan of our products. That's the other thing. I'm a consumer myself, and I've seen
Helps.
the benefits. So yeah, that's why I also feel, let's say, proud of showing what we do.
I love that. I think that's a great place to wrap. But before we lose you, Stephanie, I do have one final question for you. And that is, as somebody who's been posting on LinkedIn for as long as you have, and I'm sure there's going to be a couple that you can choose from here, but what's the biggest win that you've seen from posting on LinkedIn? And I'm going to throw an additional question. If you can't think of one, what's the biggest win you've heard about? So maybe from a colleague or somebody like that.
Yes, so first part will be the opportunities I have to engage with people that I feel inspired to, let's say, to even have these 101s for me to get an outsider view from a different industry, a different company, so we can, let's say, fit each other with what has been our challenges, best practices, etc. But also the opportunities I have to start building my brand as a public speaker. Okay. And secondly, and I'm not sure if you have covered this already in the podcast, but we have the case that was quite, let's say, it's been viral for the last couple of weeks. It's the case of Lara Botur, which she became the first, let's say, corporate influencer at Deloitte. So I wanted to wrap up with the fact that we get to use LinkedIn wherever we're looking for a new job. But what about exploring opportunities within our current jobs? Okay. And that's the case of Lara. So I don't discourage employees to also use it to gain visibility internally.
I am so glad that you've touched on that, because often when people are talking about how employee advocacy and building a personal brand can help you find other opportunities, especially when we're speaking with program managers, they'll often shy away from it because they don't want to highlight the fact that their employees might grow their personal brands and then get headhunted. But the reality is, it's not always coming from external sources. The opportunities that arise, more often than not, frankly, from what we've seen, are like the examples that you've just showcased, where it's internal opportunities as well.
I think that also applies for the end users massively. You just get so much more visibility, but also, although not necessarily the value in this conversation, like for program managers as well, like the people that are running this show, for a lot of people, there's so many stakeholders involved. All of a sudden they have loads of visibility. I've seen so many program managers and end users generate a lot of internal opportunity off the back of all of this, even if it's just exposure to different areas of the business as well.
Indeed, I managed to get to know colleagues that I never knew, and they have approached me because of this. And it's not like, oh yes, I'm getting a new role. No, I'm networking with another colleague, and then we can exchange ideas. As simple as that.
That's brilliant. Yeah. And it's again, it's something we've heard on the podcast before, and I wish I could remember the episode, but I'm sure Selena will find it and pull it up if not. But somebody had told us how they'd been posting on LinkedIn for only a short period of time. It was a couple of months, but then they were at a company conference, and then it was the CEO of the company they got talking. It's just like, oh, I know who you are. I've seen your posts. And it's like, when else, other than at the company conferences, would you get the chance to get in front of your CEO like that, especially in larger organizations? But also the one I have to highlight, Stephanie, is, we were introduced via Selena, one of my colleagues, who's also the editor of this podcast. I know that she was impressed with what she saw on LinkedIn, and that's why this podcast ended up happening. So the fact that we're even speaking today, I think, is a personal branding win.
Indeed.
But I'll hand it back over to you, Stephanie. So the floor is yours. If you wanted to tell our listeners a little bit about what you're working on right now, or where they can follow your work.
Sure. So, of course, you can follow me on LinkedIn, but at the moment, I'm working, let's say, backstage, building, let's say, the basis for whatever I want to do next. But anyway, since I love public speaking, and every opportunity I get to do this, to go to an event and network with people outside of my network, I'm more than happy. So please reach out to me through LinkedIn, especially if you wanna explore, let's say, or to cover in topics related to professional growth and leadership. I'm in.
Love that. And if there's an event coming up in London soon where you'll be speaking,
Let me know.
which you'll have to attend because we'll see you there. But Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you,
Bye
guys.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.